Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. We have a very exciting installment of the Conservation Lecture Series today, celebrating California Biodiversity Day. My name is Whitney Albright, and I work in the Science Institute here at the Department of Fish and Wildlife and help to organize the Conservation Lecture Series. And I'm going to go over a few quick announcements, kind of logistics for the lecture before we get started. And then I'll turn it over to my colleague, Madeline Drake, who is going to talk a little bit more about Biodiversity Day and then also introduce our guest speaker. So before we get too far, a couple of quick announcements. You've probably noticed that you are all muted. That is to help us preserve the audio quality for our recording. The lecture today will be recorded, and then it'll be posted within a couple of weeks to our lecture series website. We have a link here at the bottom of the page. So if you'd like to view the lecture again, or if you know of anyone that may have missed the lecture and would like to watch it, please direct them to that website where you can view the recording. As far as flow today, in a minute here, I'll turn it over to Madeline, and then we'll turn it over to our guest speaker. We'll have a presentation for about 45 minutes to an hour, and then we'll have a dedicated time for Q&A at the end of the talk. I do encourage you to type questions into the Q&A box throughout the presentation, and then we'll relay those to our speaker at the end. Do please use the Q&A box to submit your questions. There is also a chat box, which I realize can be a little bit confusing. We like to use the Q&A box for questions because it's a little bit easier for us to sort and kind of filter through those. All right, with that, I will turn it over to you, Madeline, to talk a little bit more about Biodiversity Day.
Great, thank you so much, Whitney. And hi, everyone. My name is Madeline Drake, and I'm the Interim Biodiversity Coordinator with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife Science Institute. Thank you so much for joining us today for this special conservation lecture series to celebrate California Biodiversity Day. September 7th marks the anniversary of the launch of California's Biodiversity Initiative in 2018 to ensure the future of California's biodiversity by integrating biodiversity protection into the state's environmental and economic goals and efforts. This year, we're excited to have many partners joining us hosting Biodiversity Day events that started on September 4th and go through September 12th. All of these events celebrate the state's exceptional biodiversity while also encouraging actions to protect it. If you haven't already, I invite you to visit the webpage, www.resources.ca.gov/biodiversityday2021, as seen on the slide, to learn more about other events that are taking place. But for this event, I couldn't be more excited to introduce to you our guest, Dr. Doug Tallamy. He is the T.A. Baker Professor of Agriculture in the Department of Entomology and Wildlife Ecology at the University of Delaware. He has authored 104 research publications and has taught insect-related courses for 40 years. His research focuses on understanding the many ways insects interact with plants and how such interactions determine the diversity of animal communities. He authored the book Bringing Home Nature in 2007 and was awarded the 2008 Silver Medal by the Garden Writers Association. In 2014, he co-authored the book The Living Landscape with Rick Dark, and in 2020, he authored the New York Times bestseller Nature's Best Hope. His latest book was just released earlier this year, titled The Nature of Oaks. We invited Dr. Tallamy to speak with us today because we've been really inspired by his work in his Homegrown National Park Initiative, which is a grassroots call to action for everyone to be involved in regenerating biodiversity. Today, he's going to be talking with us about his simple steps that each of us can and must take to reverse the declining biodiversity and how we ourselves are nature's best hope. I couldn't be more excited to welcome Dr. Doug Tallamy.
Thank you very much, Madeline. Screen share. Okay, it looks like it's working. I'm very happy to be here today to celebrate Biodiversity Day. You know, as usual, California is leading the way in good ideas. We should have National Biodiversity Day, and we ought to celebrate it because we're not going to be here without biodiversity. So that's worth celebrating. Okay, I want to talk to you today about Nature's Best Hope. Before I do that, I want to visit what happened in 2019 in the East Coast, we have what we call an oak mast, where members of the red oak group got together and decided to make their acorns at the same time. This is what it looks like. It looked like in a lot of places. I am easily entertained, so I took one of those acorns and I stared at it, and I was rewarded because an insect started to chew its way out of the acorn. First, it chewed a little hole for its head, stuffed its head through there. Then it stuffed its entire body through that hole. It was a tight squeeze, looked like the Pillsbury Doughboy. Finally, it plopped down. That's a dangerous time for this insect larva because it's good to eat. A lot of things are after it. So it wiggles and squirms its way beneath the soil surface in about 30 seconds. And once it's underground, it stretches in all directions and forms a chamber. And within that chamber, converts itself to a pupa and then stays there for 2 years. After 2 years, comes out as an acorn weevil. That's what an acorn weevil looks like. A lot of people think weevils have big noses because it looks like they do, but that's actually an extension of the head capsule. And the mouth parts are way down here at the end of that extension. And they take those mouth parts and chew a hole into the center of the acorn, turn around and lay an egg in that hole. And that's how the larva gets down there. You might wonder why they spend 2 years underground before they come out as an adult. Most insects come out after 1 year. The reason is it takes red oak acorns 18 months to complete their development. So if they came out the next year, there wouldn't be enough acorns for them. After they leave the acorn, of course, that leaves a hole, a true vacuum. And you know that nature abhors a vacuum. And in this case, she has filled it with 3 species of temnothorax ants, tiny little ants where the entire colony lives in the holes made by acorn weevils when they leave acorns. And if they discover a new acorn, they get very excited because their old home is falling apart. So they tell everybody it's time to move. And they grab the larvae, they grab the eggs, they move the entire colony into the new acorn in about 30 minutes. Then they post a guard here, make sure nobody else comes in. And this is where they'll live for the next 2 years. What's my point? It's very simple. That is simply one of literally millions of very specialized interactions largely between animals and plants. And they comprise the bulk of nature. This is another one, the relationship between jays all over the world, actually, and oaks. Jays are the primary disperser of oak acorns. They take those acorns and fly up to a mile from the tree, then tap it beneath the soil surface. For every 4 acorns a jay buries, they only remember where one of them is. So they're actually planting 3 oak trees for every 4 acorns. And a single jay can move up to 4,500 acorns in a season. So oak dispersal really depends on jays. The specialized relationship between pileated woodpeckers and carpenter ants. That's what they feed their young. They rear their young on carpenter ants. So you won't have pileated woodpeckers without carpenter ants, and you won't have carpenter ants unless you have the big trees that make those carpenter ants. You won't have the beloved Emarginia unless you have mistletoe. And you won't have these mistletoes unless you have the oaks to support them. That's the only host plant that they eat. You won't have 60 species of California native bees without the pollen of sunflowers. Pollen specialization is very, very common in our native bees. We have about 4,000 species of them, and over a third of them are specialized on particular plant genera. So nature really is a series of specialized relationships. I could talk about them all day long, but the point I want to make is that these relationships, nature itself is on the ropes these days. And it's on the ropes because we did not take Teddy Roosevelt's advice. Way back in 1908, Teddy heard that the state of Arizona was going to mine the Grand Canyon. So he went to the canyon, looked out over the edge, and he said, "Leave it as it is." And those 5 words, he started the process of creating the Grand Canyon National Park. Of course, leaving the country as it was is no longer an option because we didn't do that. There's only about 5% of the lower 48 states that's anything close to its original pristine ecological condition. And that's because we have logged the country repeatedly. We have tilled it. We have drained it. We've grazed it. We've got 750 million, maybe 770 million acres of rangeland in the US, which is 4.5 times the size of Texas. And of course, we paved it or otherwise developed it. We have straightened our rivers and dammed them, and you can spell that any way you want. We have polluted our skies and changed our climate for centuries to come. We have drained our aquifers. We've introduced more than 3,300 species of plants from other continents, many of which are running amok in our natural areas. In fact, we have carved up those natural areas into tiny remnants of their former selves. And each one of those remnants is too small and too isolated from other remnants to sustain the species that run the ecosystems that we all depend on. You might wonder why we've done this. I wonder why we've done this. So I can only guess. I think we figured the Earth, our nest, was so big we could foul it forever and there wouldn't be any consequences at all. But of course, we were wrong about that. And that's why we're seeing pretty scary headlines these days, like the insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Talking about global insect decline. Followed by this one, North America has lost 3 billion breeding birds in the last 50 years. That's almost a third of our North American bird population, already gone. Followed by this one, the UN says that we're likely to lose 1 million species to extinction, and it may happen as soon as the next 20 years. And I love the way they report this, as if it's just another headline. They might as well say we're going to lose oxygen in the next 20 years and then go on to the next headline, as if it doesn't matter. Losing 1 million species is not an option, folks. We have to make sure that doesn't happen. So I could go on talking about the pox that we humans have delivered upon the environment, thus upon all of our houses, but that's not what this talk is about. This talk is about a cure for that pox. It's a cure that'll take small efforts from lots of people, but those efforts will deliver enormous physical, psychological, and environmental benefits to everybody. Let's return briefly to this headline. The insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Well, the great E.O. Wilson told us what it would mean if we were to lose insects, and he did it way back in 1987 with this paper, The Little Things That Run the World. His message was very clear. Life as we know it depends on insects. And if they were to disappear, so would most of the flowering plants. And if most of the flowering plants disappeared, that would so drastically change energy flow through our terrestrial habitats that the food webs that support our animals, the amphibians, the reptiles, the birds, the mammals, those food webs would collapse and all those animals would disappear. The biosphere, the living portion of the earth, would rot because we would have lost insect decomposers that rapidly turn over nutrients, and all we'd have is bacteria and fungi. And of course, humans would not survive any of those drastic changes. The good news is that doesn't have to happen. We could save our insects, we could save our birds, we could save nature itself, but we're going to have to change the way we landscape in order to do it. Why is that? Well, remember, humans are products of nature. We are totally dependent on it, totally dependent on what we call ecosystem services. Here are just a few of the things that plants do. And we always say plants do for us. They do it for all the living things on the planet. Like produce oxygen, pretty important. Clean water, slow its journey to the sea where it's too salty to use. Capturing carbon, enormously important today, pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, building their tissues out of that carbon, and then pumping the extra carbon into the ground. Our soils are brown or black because of carbon that plant roots have deposited there over the eons. Plants are building topsoil, they're holding it in place, they're preventing floods, they're dampening severe weather, really important today, converting sunlight into food. If we lose our plants, we're going to have to eat sunlight. I wish us luck on that one. What do animals do for plants? They provide pest control services. They pollinate nearly 90% of our flowering plants. They disperse plant seeds. So designing landscapes like this that destroy the production of ecosystem services is not a good idea. It never was a good idea, but today it's an absolutely terrible idea because we need more ecosystem services today just for humans than ever before. We've got 7.8, 7.9 billion people on the planet. Designing areas that reduce the ability of the planet to support us is not a good idea. Now, there have been visionaries through the ages who have recognized that we humans needed to work on our relationship with planet Earth. And Aldo Leopold was one of the most eloquent, wrote extensively in the first half of the 1900s. One of the things he said is the oldest task in human history is to live in a piece of land without spoiling it. Now, there have been indigenous groups that have been able to do that for long periods, but our huge Western societies and our huge Asian societies have been terrible at doing that. We habitually take more from the earth than it has to offer, completely wrecking an area, then going to another area and doing the same thing. Clearly not sustainable behavior. So Aldo Leopold had a dream. He dreamt that we humans were actually capable of developing what he called a land ethic. He knew we had to use the earth. We had to farm and lumber and graze and mine and do all of those things. But he believed we could learn to do them gently enough that we did not destroy local ecosystems. And that's what he called the land ethic. He wrote about it in the Sand County Almanac. What he never talked about, though, was developing a land ethic where we actually lived. And I'm not sure why that was, but I suspect the notion that humans and nature cannot coexist in the same place at the same time That notion was so deeply embedded in the culture of Aldo Leopold's day, still embedded in our own culture, that he might not have recognized it as an option. What I want to argue today, though, is that not only is living with nature an option, it is now the only viable option that's left to us. In the past, conservationists worked pretty much exclusively where there weren't a lot of people. We now need to turn that on its head. We need to save nature, actually reconstruct it where we've dismantled it, where there are a lot of people, because that's pretty much everywhere. In other words, we have to find ways for nature to thrive in human-dominated landscapes, not hang on by a thread, but thrive. Where are we going to start? Let's go to private property. 85.6% of the US east of the Mississippi is privately owned. 78% of the entire country is privately owned. California actually has the least amount of private property, only 52%, but it's still a huge amount of the area that is privately owned. If we ignore private property, if we don't do conservation on private property, we're going to fail because most of the land is privately owned. When I'm talking about conservation, I'm misusing the word. I am not talking about conserving the areas of nature that are not yet destroyed. We do want to do that, that's for sure. But there's not that many of those areas left. So I'm really talking about rebuilding nature where we already have dismantled it. And yes, I know it won't be exactly the way it was before we dismantled it. But that's okay. We can still reunite enough of the specialized interactions that comprise the bulk of nature to form functioning ecosystems. And that's the goal. But there are not all species contribute to ecosystem function equally. So we have to start with the building blocks. We have to start with the most important species. And there are two groups that we cannot do without. One of them is the flowering plants and the pollinators that allow those flowering plants to reproduce. They're, of course, capturing the energy from the sun, turning it into food, storing it in their parts, but mostly their leaves. So now we have the energy from the sun as food in plant leaves. We have to get it to the animals. Most vertebrates don't eat plants directly. Most vertebrates eat invertebrates that eat plants directly. And most of those invertebrates are caterpillars. It turns out that caterpillars are transferring more energy from plants to other animals than any other type of plant eater. So when we're designing landscapes, we have to make sure they include a lot of caterpillars or they will have failed food webs. And then we will have failed ourselves. I'm going to give you an example from the Carolina chickadee. Chickadees all over the country, different species are all very similar, doing pretty much the same thing. Chickadees, of course, are at our feeders eating seed all winter long. 50% of a chickadee's diet is seed in the winter, but the other 50% is insects. And when they reproduce, it becomes 100%. Their babies cannot eat seeds, so they switch to insects. And if they're in a healthy environment, they will feed their young exclusively on caterpillars. And they are not exceptions. Turns out that most birds, 96% of our terrestrial birds, are rearing their young on insects, and most of those insects are caterpillars. How do I know that? Well, there's a number of lines of evidence that suggest that, but this is a citizen science project that one of my PhD students did a few years ago, Ashley Kennedy. She put out a call to bird photographers across the country and said, please take pictures of birds during the breeding season when they're carrying food to the nest. Send those pictures to Ashley. She's going to identify them. And the object is to identify the prey items in the beaks of the birds and reconstruct the nestling diet for as many species of birds in continental US as possible. She got thousands of pictures, did a lot of identification. And this is a summary of her results. The green bars are the percentage of the nestling diets of 20 of the most common bird families in North America that were caterpillars. And in 16 out of the 20 bird families, caterpillars dominated the diet. So again, what would happen if we design landscapes that don't have enough caterpillars? Most of our birds would not be able to reproduce. So there's something special about caterpillars. Let's talk about what it might be. There's actually several things special about caterpillars. And one of them is that they're soft. They're relatively soft prey items. Think of this guy as if he's a little sausage with a very thin wrapper. That wrapper is exoskeleton. It's cuticle. It's made of chitin. It's undigestible. So birds don't want a lot of that. And because caterpillars are soft, you can stuff them down the throat of your offspring without fear of injuring it. If you've ever watched a parent bird rear their young, they're pretty rough. They take that prey and just stuff it down there like a plunger. Caterpillars are also relatively large prey items. One medium-sized caterpillar is equal to the biomass of 200 aphids. So many of our smaller birds do chase aphids around, but do you want to chase 200 aphids or get one caterpillar? They're nutritious. They're very high in fat, very high in protein, low percentage of chitin, of exoskeleton, compared to many other types of insects, particularly beetles. Beetles are not like little sausages. They're like little tanks. And a lot of beetles have very sharp edges too. And it turns out that caterpillars are the best source of carotenoids for birds during the breeding season. Now, I mentioned carotenoids not because I love organic chemistry, but because I'm a vertebrate and you're a vertebrate and birds are vertebrates, and we vertebrates cannot make our own carotenoids. Only plants make carotenoids. So we have to get our carotenoids from plants, and we have to get them from plants because carotenoids are essential components of vertebrate diets. What do carotenoids do for birds and us? Well, they're antioxidants. They run around our body, protect our DNA from oxidative damage. They stimulate the immune system. From our own perspective, I can't think of a better time to have a very strong immune system. They improve color vision. When your mother said, eat your carrots, you will see better, she was right. She didn't know she was right, but it turns out she was right. They improve sperm vitality, improve sexual attractiveness. Now I'm talking about things like this male prothonotary warbler who is bright yellow because he's had access to lots of luteins. He takes those luteins, makes pigments out of them, puts them in his feathers, and the brighter yellow he is, the more ladies he attracts. Where are they getting their carotenoids from? From what they eat, of course, but carotenoid content of bird prey items is not equally distributed. These first two bars here are types of caterpillars. They have far more carotenoids than other bird prey. Here are the adult caterpillars down here, the moths and butterflies themselves, far fewer carotenoids because they're not eating green leaves. It's the caterpillars that eat the green leaves, and that's where the carotenoids are. And here's the earthworm way down here. So the early bird gets the worm, but he doesn't get any carotenoids when he gets the worm. So that study and several others are suggesting that caterpillars are not optional parts of bird diets. They're essential parts of bird diets. So let's just say birds need caterpillars. The next question is, how many do they need? Is one or two enough, or one or two a day enough? Let's go back to chickadees. Again, a lot of data on chickadees. How many caterpillars does it take to make a nest of chickadees? Thousands. One or two is not enough. One or two a day is not enough. It takes thousands of caterpillars, 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars, depending on the number of chicks in the nest, to get that nest to the point where those chicks fledge. And after they fledge, the parents continue to feed them caterpillars another 21 days, but they're flying all around, so nobody's been able to count those. So you're really talking about tens of thousands of caterpillars to make one clutch of a bird that's a third of an ounce. That's 4 pennies worth of bird. And if you want chickadees to breed in your yard, you need all those caterpillars in your yard, because chickadees only forage about 50 meters from the nest. They're not flying 5 miles down the road to the nearest woodlot. And if you don't have all those caterpillars in your yard, that's called insect decline. And it's really looking like insect decline is one of the primary causes of bird declines. We went to the original data set from Rosenberg et al. That's the group that said we've lost 3 billion birds in the last 50 years. And we divided the terrestrial bird species into two groups: the species that require insects, typically when they're reproducing, and the species that don't ever require insects, things like doves and finches that can reproduce on seeds. Well, the ones that don't need insects didn't lose any numbers at all in the last 50 years, but the birds that require insects lost on average 10 million individuals per species. This doesn't prove cause and effect, but it certainly is suggestive that as you take away bird food, you lose the birds. So if we don't want to lose our birds and all the other things that depend on insects that I'm not talking about, we need to change our goal for landscaping. In the past, we have landscaped strictly for aesthetics. We didn't think about the ecological roles of the plants we put in our yards. But if we want to have other living things around, and we do because they run the ecosystems we depend on, we have to landscape in a way that creates the insects that support those other little things, other living things. So how do we add caterpillars to our landscapes? We do that by putting the plants that support caterpillars in our landscapes. And that seems easy enough, but there is a catch. And that is that most plants don't support a lot of caterpillars. So we have to be fussy about it. We have to add the plants that do. And we have to be fussy about it because the caterpillars themselves are fussy about what they eat. And the monarch butterfly illustrates that perfectly. You can have all the eucalyptus and all of the Asian and Mediterranean plants that we typically landscape with in your yard, and you won't make a single monarch butterfly. unless you have milkweed. That is the only plant that they develop on. That's called host plant specialization. And it turns out that most of the insects that eat plants are host plant specialists. Why are they specialists? Because plants have made them that way. Plants don't want to be eaten. They want to capture the energy from the sun and use it for their own growth and reproduction. So they've loaded their leaves with nasty tasting chemicals, secondary metabolic compounds that make those leaves either bitter or downright toxic. And it's a really effective defense that keeps most of the insects of the world from eating most of the plants of the world. And that's why it's green out there. I guess in California, it spends a lot of time being brown, but when it rains, it's green because it's not because there's no insects out there that want to eat those plants. It's because the insects that are out there cannot eat most of the plants. They are too well protected. But we do know that insects eat plants. So how do they do that? How do they get around those chemical defenses? Well, this is where the specialization comes in. 90% of the insects that eat plants are what we call host plant specialists. Every plant lineage that's out there protects itself with a unique cocktail of chemical defenses. And a single insect species cannot adapt to all of them. So they pick one or two plant lineages that are really similar in how they're protecting themselves. And they develop the enzymes that store and excrete and detoxify those compounds, the behavioral adaptations and life history adaptations that minimize the insect's exposure to those compounds. It takes a long period of evolutionary history with those particular plant lineages for all those adaptations to fall into place. But once they do, the insect is then locked into eating that particular group of plants. And that's why when we take the milkweeds out of our yards, the monarchs don't start eating eucalyptus. They can't do it. They're locked into milkweed. So the only option they have is to disappear. It's also why when we bring in any plant from another continent, our insects are not adapted to eating it. So all I'm trying to say here is that plant choice matters. If we're trying to rebuild the food webs that we have dismantled by our heavy human footprint, we have to choose the right plants or it's not going to work. And I'm going to give you 3 examples of how well it does work. Starting with our house here in Southeast Pennsylvania, we bought a section of a farm that was broken up. It's a very old farm, had been farmed for about 300 years. And the last thing they did before we moved in was to mow it for hay. So there were very few plants there. And the goal, of course, was to restore the biodiversity on that particular piece of property. But you do that by adding the plants that support the caterpillars, that support the food web, that supports everything else that's out there. So these are a few examples of how I actually did that. I wanted to see if I could attract the Canadian owlet to our yard. Now, I'd never even seen a Canadian owlet, but that's what one looks like. That's what the adult looks like, just like a leaf. But I knew that if I were going to have Canadian owlets, I had to have meadow rue. That is the only plant that they eat. We didn't have any meadow rue. I'm sure there was meadow rue here hundreds of years ago, but long gone with the heavy development. So I got some seeds from someplace else and I planted the meadow rue. It grew very nicely. But this was early on, and I actually had very little confidence that Canadian owlets would be able to find my meadow rue. So I didn't even go out and check it for a couple months after I planted it. But when I finally did, it was covered with Canadian owlets. So it was a very rapid success, huge success. Now we have a good population of meadow rue and Canadian owlets. So we've added 2 species to the property. Same story with the goldenrod stowaway. This beautiful moth actually has nothing to do with goldenrod. That's a misnomer. It's a specialist on this plant, Biden's aristosa, ditch daisy. I did know where there was some ditch daisy in a power line cut about 14 miles away. So I got some seeds, planted them at home. They grew very nicely. Took a year for the goldenrod stowaway to find my Bidens. It finally did. And now we've got a good population of both of those. Now we've added 4 species to the property. Wanted the Hackberry Emperor, not because it's the most beautiful butterfly, but because it belongs here. It's a butterfly that belongs here. Well, like its name suggests, it's a specialist on hackberry, and we didn't have any hackberry. So I planted hackberry. Took 4 years for the butterflies to find my hackberry, but they finally did. I checked one of my hackberry branches in June, and there were 10 Hackberry Emperor caterpillars on a single branch. So another big success. Now we've added 6 species, and that's how it went. I did not plant goldenrod, came in on its own. And along with the goldenrod came many of the things that require goldenrod, like the beautiful brown hooded owlet, the Arcigera flower moth, the goldenrod leaf miner, the distinct Sparaginothus, the goldenrod gall moth. This is one that hasn't come, the goldenrod flower moth. I don't know why it hasn't found our goldenrod, but that's what the caterpillars look like. But this is part of the fun. This is anticipation. It's like waiting for the ketchup to come out of the bottle. Every year I check my goldenrod right about now, this time of year, hoping to find some goldenrod flower moth caterpillars. One of these years I will, and that'll be a great year. Planted Virginia creeper. A lot of people in the East don't like Virginia creeper. I don't know why though. It's an excellent native plant. It's got good fall color. It can climb our trees without girdling them, makes nutritious berries for the birds in the fall. Really good pollinator plant, even though the flowers are not showy, the native bees love them. And it's the major host plant for the large sphinx moths that are the primary component of cardinal diets, like the Pandora sphinx. That's what its beautiful adult looks like. The lettered sphinx, the hog sphinx, the abbot sphinx, all on Virginia creeper. Wanted to see if I could attract the double-toothed prominent, just because it's such a cool looking caterpillar. Even if you don't like caterpillars, you got to like this guy. It's a specialist on elm, particularly American elm. Of course, we had the Dutch elm disease, took out all of our elms, but there are two very large elms at the University of Delaware that did not die. And every year they make a lot of seed. So I got some of the seed, scooped it up out of the gutter, planted some at home. That was 19 years ago. Those trees are about 80 feet tall now. And they brought in the double-toothed prominent right away, American elm. Wanted to see if I could get the evening primrose moth because it's beautiful. I like beauty like anybody else. Well, in order to get the evening primrose moth, you have to have evening primrose, and we didn't have any, so I planted it. The moth came, spends the day with its head stuffed in the flowers. You've got a beautiful moth, an evening primrose too, the Pacific green sphinx moth. It's on my bucket list. I've got to collect that one of these days, but you won't have it if you don't have evening primrose. And I planted lots of oaks. Now, this is the Oregon oak, or the Quercus garryana. I took this picture from the web, and it was called the girl tree. And I said, wonder why they're calling it the girl tree. And then I noticed there is a girl in this tree. That wasn't the goal here. But I guarantee you can plant oats and you won't end up with girls in your trees. But I'm mentioning oaks because they're such important plants. First of all, these are just examples of the plants I have added to our yard. But oaks, of course, they can live an awful long time. And a lot of people say, I don't want to plant an oak because I won't live long enough to enjoy it. And if you have to wait 400 years to enjoy your oaks, then you're right. You won't live long enough to enjoy it. But if you can enjoy what your oaks contribute to your landscape, you can enjoy them right away. And I can say that with confidence because I planted most of my oaks as acorns, which means they were free. And a few of them as bare root 2-foot whips that cost $1.50 each. So cost wasn't an issue. And immediately they started to rebuild the food web that supports the birds and everything else in my yard by attracting all the moths that comprise that food web. Things like the solitary oak leaf miner, Juvenil's dusky wing, the yellow-shouldered moth, Suzuki's Promolactus, the red-washed caterpillar, the yellow-vested moth, the orange-tufted oneida, the spiny oak caterpillar, the two-spotted oak punky, the variable oak leaf caterpillar, the red-humped oak worm, the orange-humped oak worm, the pink-striped oak worm, the hesitant dagger moth, the lesser oak dagger moth, the greater oak dagger moth, the streaked dagger moth, the afflicted dagger moth, the crowned bucolatrix, the orange-patched smoky wing, the white-blotched heterocampa, the oblique heterocampa, the red-lined panapoda, the laugher, and literally hundreds more species of moths have come to the oaks on my property, and they have come right away. This is a pin oak that has just popped its head above the leaves, and there is a caterpillar standing on the ground eating the leaves at that tree. So you don't have to wait hundreds of years for your oaks to start to contribute to your local food web, and that's what restoration is all about. It's about building that healthy food web. This is what our house looks like today. I'll show you this to convince you that we're very traditional. We have a little lawn here, but I put a lot of the plants back. I'm still adding plants, and I will be for a while. But about 4 years ago, I made it a goal to take a picture of every species of moth that now makes a living on our property. So remember, you count the caterpillars, then you know how successful your restoration has been. And I am up to 1,134 species of moths. And every time I go out to find some, I find new ones. So who knows how high that number will be. Now we have 10 acres. Pennsylvania is 2.4 million acres. So on 240,000th of the landmass, we have 44% of all the moths that occur in the entire state. And because so many of those moths are types of bird food, there are 60 species of birds that have bred on our 10 acres, not flew by, but bred. Why am I telling you all this? Well, this is another headline we saw last year. The World Wildlife Fund said that the Earth has lost 2/3 of its wildlife since 1970. But I'm thinking, not at our house. I'm sure we have increased biodiversity by at least 2/3, and it didn't take that long. And all we had to do was put the plants back. It's not that hard. We can turn these terrible, frightening headlines around. It's going to take a lot of us, but we can do it. Now, I know what you're thinking. We have 10 acres. A lot of people don't have that much land. Will it work on smaller lots, perhaps in suburbia? That's a good question. Let's go to Margie and Dan Terpster's house in Kirkwood, Missouri. They have 0.6 acres, 18 times less land than Cindy and I have. And the first thing they did when they moved in, and by the way, they're in the middle of a development. Everybody's got the big lawns. The first thing they did was take out the invasive plant, which is very common there. That's Amur honeysuckle, bush honeysuckle. Planted a lot of native species, put in a water feature they call a bubbler, and then they sat back and started to count the birds that were using their yard. They're up to 149 bird species that have used their yard, including 35 warbler species. Just to put that in perspective, Cindy and I have only counted 8 warbler species at our house. So does it work on smaller properties? Absolutely. What about urban yards? Let's go to Pam Carlson's house in Chicago. And I mean in Chicago, right on the other side of this wall is one of the runways of O'Hare Airport. Over here is Kennedy Expressway. Pam has 1/10 of an acre. That's 3 times smaller than the average lot size. And it's not connected to any type of natural area. So she's a tiny little island in the middle of Chicago. It's a pretty island, but it's tiny. Well, she did the same thing. She took out her invasive plants, put in 60 species of native plants, added a water feature for the birds. And then she sat back and started to count the birds that have used her yard. And she's up to 120 species, including a woodcock. There's Pam's woodcock. So if you haven't seen a woodcock lately, go to Pam's house in Chicago. What about city centers? 82% of us live right in the heart of cities. Are all those people going to be left out? Well, in 2014, I was staring at this plant, Asclepias tuberosa, butterfly weed. And that reminds me, we have a marketing issue with our native plants. We call them weeds. I wonder why people don't plant them. So let's not call this butterfly weed. Let's call it Monarch's Delight. Okay, I was staring at Monarch's Delight 2014. The first thing I saw were 2 species of leafcutter bee, megachilid bees. There was a big one and a small one. I know they're megachilid bees because they carry their pollen on their tummies, not on their legs. Well, leafcutter bees have very strict requirements. Not only do they need pollen and nectar, but they also need soft leaves. Leaves of redbud are perfect because they carve out the edges of those leaves and leave little semicircles. Take the edge they carved out and roll it up into a tube and stuff it full of pollen, lay their egg on it, and that is how they reproduce. Then they take that whole package and stick it in a crack or a crevice. Well, there was redbud right next to the Monarch's Delight. So the bees had everything they needed. Of course, they were there. That's probably why there were bumblebees there as well. More than one species. Bumblebees overwinter as queens. So when they come out in the spring, they don't have any workers to help them. So they need access to abundant, very convenient forage. That's exactly what redbud provides. And then the queen can easily get that colony going. And then I saw a monarch. Actually, I saw 2 monarchs on Monarch's Delight. Now, this was 2014. In 2013, in the East, there were only 3.6% of the monarchs left compared to 1976. It was the low point of the monarch population. And this was June. It was very early in the season for us to be seeing monarchs this far north. So I was encouraged, maybe the monarchs weren't going to disappear after all. Why were they there? Well, they had Monarch's Delight, but there was another species of milkweed there as well. I think it's purple milkweed. So the monarchs had what they needed. They had nectar, but they also had host plants. They could lay their eggs and continue their population. Do you know where I was? I was on the High Line in the middle of Manhattan, New York City. The High Line is a renovated, it used to be an elevated railroad. It's 30 feet above the taxis, but it's in the middle of the city. Somebody went up there several years ago and saw that there were a lot of native plants up there that had seeded in themselves. Nobody was taking care of them. So they decided to make it a tourist destination, and they fixed it up. It is now a major tourist destination. Literally millions of people go to the High Line to enjoy a little strip of nature in the middle of Manhattan every single year. So there's not much there, but what is there is very pretty. This is Rick Dark. He was always after me to go to the High Line, see the beautiful plants. I'm not much of a city boy, so I dragged my feet. I really wasn't interested in going. Seeing beautiful plants that nothing is using is actually depressing to me. And that's what I figured I would see on the High Line. You know, what is going to use Monarch's Delight or any of the other plants in the middle of Manhattan? They won't be able to find it. But I was totally wrong. Somebody's just done a study of the native bees on the High Line. They're up to 30 species that are using it. So this has convinced me that thoughtful native plantings, and the High Line's not 100% native, but thoughtful native plantings are capable of bringing life back to just about anywhere. If they can do it in Manhattan, they can do it anywhere. And that's very encouraging. There are 4 things we need to think about if we're going to succeed in a big way, and we do want to succeed in a big way. One of them doesn't apply to you very much in California, but it sure applies to the rest of the nation. And that is, we've got to shrink the area we have in lawn. We've got over 40 million acres of lawn, and that is a 2005 statistic, so we know it's a lot more than that now, dedicated to an ecological dead space. That's bigger than the area of New England, by the way. It's a status symbol, and the way we maintain it, of course, it does not encourage any biodiversity at all. So let's cut the area of lawn in half. So we're going to keep half the area of lawn, and we can manicure it. It can still be our status symbol and our message to the culture around us that we're playing the game, but we're going to heavily plant the other half. And if we do that, that'll give us 20 million acres to work with just by cutting the area of lawn in half. I'm suggesting we call that 20 million acres Homegrown National Park. We're going to do this at home. And it'll be bigger than the Adirondacks, plus Yellowstone, plus Yosemite, plus Grand Tetons, Canyonlands, Mount Rainier, North Cascades, Badlands National Park, Olympic National Park, Sequoia National Park, plus the Grand Canyon, plus Denali, which is huge, plus the Great Smoky Mountains. You add up all those parks, still less than 20 million acres. So Homegrown National Park will be the biggest park in the country. What do you get when you put some part of nature at home? You get the opportunity to develop a personal relationship with the natural world. Maybe you had one as a child and you've lost it. You can renew that relationship or develop it for the first time, and you can do it at your own time, your own pace, simply by going outside. You can avoid crowds. I don't know if you've seen the headlines about the millions of people at the national parks this year. 367 million people, I believe, visit our national parks. So when you visit a national park, you're visiting other people rather than the spaces you actually go to see. It's free. There's no admission fee. It's never closed, no matter what pandemic comes down the pike. No travel hassles. You get to experience the natural world alone, which I think is necessary for building that personal relationship, just you and Mother Nature. And this is particularly important for our kids who are suffering from nature deficit disorder. According to Richard Louv, we're trying. We get 30 kids and put them on a bus with a teacher, and they drive for an hour and they walk around in a natural space. And the teacher tells them not to touch anything. Then they get back in the bus and they go home, and that's their exposure to the natural world, which I'm sure is better than nothing. But it's really been an exposure to 30 other kids and a teacher telling them not to touch anything. If they have some part of the natural world at home, they can go outside alone, no parental supervision, let them develop that relationship in a way that works for them. It's critically important that they do that because our kids are the future stewards of the planet. And if they don't know why they're stewarding, how to steward, if they don't love what they're stewarding, they're going to be lousy stewards, and we can't afford any more of that. And maybe they will learn how to hunt lizards. I'm learning this from my own granddaughter, Zoe, who lives in Hawaii on a very modest piece of nature. It's a patch of lawn with a hedge, but there are anole lizards there. And she sent me this picture to tell me how you hunt lizards. You get on the ground, you cover yourself with leaves and sticks so that the lizards cannot see you coming. Then you crawl very slowly toward the lizard. No smiling. This is serious business. You can wear your best dress. That's okay. But you sneak up on the lizard, you catch the lizard, you put it in an aquarium, you learn how to take care of the lizard, you develop a personal relationship with that part of nature. Now, I don't think Zoe's going to be crawling on the ground in her best dress, catching lizards the rest of her life. But I guarantee she is going to remember catching lizards the rest of her life in Hawaii. And I also guarantee she's going to be a wonderful steward of the planet because of that relationship. If you want your kids to do more than catch lizards, get Nancy Stranicki's Nature Play at Home. Dozens of examples of how to expose your kids to nature right where they live. And if you want to join Homegrown National Park, and I encourage you to do that, first of all, it's free. There's no membership fee. This is our attempt to get beyond the choir. I've been talking about this for, 15 years. I have reached thousands of people, but I need to reach millions of people. We need to convert that 20 million acres of lawn into natural spaces by putting in the native plants that will make them that way. So I met a woman named Michelle Alpenderi. She said, I'm going to do this for you. She created this, our website and the map. The object is to get on the map. You visit the site and put in your location and the amount of area that you're going to be a good steward of with native plants. And that will establish a little dot on there, a little firefly. You have lit up that part of the map. You get to see other people in your county that have joined the map. Eventually, we want to be able to see everybody see the entire country who has joined the map. We've got 10,500 people right now that have joined Homegrown National Park. So we're on the way. The site's not a year old yet, so it's a good start, but we need a lot more. So please get on the map and encourage your friends to do that as well. Okay, we're going to shrink the lawn. What plants are we going to put in the area we take out of lawn? I am going to argue that some of them have to be what I'm calling keystone plants. Remember what a keystone is. This is the Roman arch. The keystone is the stone in the middle of the arch. If you take the keystone out, the arch collapses. Well, I'm calling these keystone plants because if you take them out of your local food web, the food web will collapse. Keystone plants are making most of the food. Just 5% of our native plants are making 75% of the caterpillar food that drives those food webs. 14% of our native plants are making 90% of the caterpillar food that drives those food webs. They're critically important. So think of the keystone plants in your yard as the 2x4s in the ecological house that you're building. They're holding up that house. You cannot build a house out of wallpaper. And that's what we've been doing, just using pretty plants from someplace else. You're not finished building your ecological house once you've added your keystone plants, but they're an essential part of it. So the question is no longer simply, are natives better than non-natives? On average, they certainly are, but there are a lot of native plants that are not contributing all that much either. So the question really is, do we want to put the most productive plants that we can find in our yard, both in terms of supporting specialist pollinators and also those caterpillars that support the food web? I get an email once in a while from somebody who says, don't I know that ginkgo biloba from Asia actually grew in North America 7 million years ago? That makes them native. That means we can plant them. That means everything will be wonderful. Yes, I do know that ginkgos grew in North America 7 million years ago. We can argue about whether that makes them native today, but I'm not going to have that argument because that's not the metric anymore. It's not whether they're native or not. It's whether they're doing anything or not. I don't care if ginkgos grew on the moon 7 million years ago. Here today, they produce 0 species of caterpillars. They are not contributing to the local food web. They are taking up space. What is contributing more than any other plant in California or North America? It's one of the oaks. 271 species of caterpillars in California, over 950 species of caterpillars supported by oaks nationwide. It's the most productive plant we can put in our landscapes in 84% of the counties in which oaks occur. No other plant genus comes close to that. This is the role of keystone oaks in the ecosystem in our yard. Now, so far, I have taken pictures of 1,134 moth species. Haven't gotten to the butterflies yet. I will get there. Out of that 1,134 species, 984 have known host plants. So there's 150 or so that we don't know what they're eating yet. Out of that 984, 287 species use oaks. And we've got 69 genera of native woody plants on our property. And only one of them is Quercus, the oaks. And we've got hundreds of genera of herbaceous plants. So oaks represent less than 1.5% of our woody plant diversity and way less than 1% of our total plant diversity, but they're supporting 29% of our moth species diversity. And who knows what percentage of the birds that breed here depend on the caterpillars that are produced by oaks. That's the role of a keystone plant. If you take it out of your local ecosystem, it really clobbers that food web. How do you find out what the keystone plants are where you live? You go to, fortunately, you guys in California are really fortunate because you've got the most powerful tool available anywhere in the country for finding out what plants to use. And it's called CalScape, produced by the California Native Plant Society. And it will show you exactly where you live and all of the plant species that occur exactly where you live. And with all the crazy biomes you've got in California, that's an essential tool. Your native oaks support 270 species, followed by arroyo willows, cottonwoods very high. And these are just examples. So take advantage of CalScape. All right, we're going to shrink the lawn. We're going to put in keystone plants. We're going to invite a lot of insects to our yard, and then we're going to kill them with our security light, which of course is not the goal. We are finding out that light pollution, there's a lot of research that's showing light pollution is one of the major causes of insect declines in the temperate zones around the world. These are all the ways that lights kill insects, particularly those all-important moths. But to me, this is good news. It's good news because we have to turn around insect decline. We've already lost 45% of the insects on the planet. And remember, they're the little things that are keeping us alive. So we've got to turn that around. If we can do that by simply flicking a switch, turning out our lights at night, we're getting off easy. I mean, that's good news. But I know what you're going to say. You can't turn the light out over your garage because the bad man will come. Okay, put a motion sensor on it so it only turns on when the bad man does come. And the first thing you're going to find out is the bad man doesn't come very often. And if you don't want to do that, take the white light out of your motion sensor, out of your security light, and put in a yellow bulb. Yellow wavelengths are far less attractive to nocturnal insects than our white wavelengths. Yellow LEDs are the best. If we were to switch out our white security lights for yellow LEDs, overnight, we'd save billions of insects and probably billions of dollars because they're so much more energy efficient. Okay, the fourth thing we need to do is to landscape in a way that allows the caterpillars to complete their development. So here's an example from the East Coast. I live in Chester County, Pennsylvania, where oaks support 511 species of caterpillars. A few of them, like the polyphemus moth, complete their development on the tree. The caterpillar eats the leaves, then it spins a cocoon and hangs from a branch, then it emerges as an adult, and then it does it all over again. I wish everything did that, but most species don't. 480 of those species, 94%, finish growing, and then they drop from the tree. And they wiggle their way beneath the surface of the soil and pupate underground, or they spin a cocoon in the leaf litter that's under the tree. And that's the problem. There is no leaf litter under the tree. And this is the way we landscape across the country. We mow and compact the soil underneath those trees so that it's rock hard. Any caterpillar that grows up here drops down and dies. I'm convinced this is another major cause of insect declines around the country, but it's easily reversed. So what most people do, of course, is have a tree in the middle of a big lawn, and we're just starting to measure what caterpillar survivorship is in a situation like this. But I guarantee it's going to be much higher in a layered landscape like this, where you have a tree, then a layered landscape. I know you get different plants in California, but we might have a dogwood here and then an azalea and ferns and ground cover. This is a safe site for those caterpillars. The caterpillars drop down. The soil's not compacted. Nobody's going to step on them. Nobody's going to mow them. They can complete their development, spin their cocoons, and everything will be great. This is a good place to do your fancy gardening. Build beds around your trees. It's a good way to shrink your lawn if you have any. Because you're putting in plants that are going to create a ground cover, another safe site for those caterpillars. Any of your ground covers that are appropriate, like yerba buena is a great one. Undisturbed, you're not going to mow it, you're not going to step on it. Another grad student, Desiree Narango, has found out that there is room for compromise in our plant choice, and she did it by studying chickadees in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. Her question was, how well are chickadee populations sustained in suburban landscapes that are landscaped primarily with native plants versus suburban yards that are landscaped primarily with introduced ornamentals? And the first thing she found is that when they're landscaped with introduced ornamentals, they produce 75% fewer caterpillars. So right away, you cut the bird food by 75%. They were 60% less likely to have breeding chickadees at all. Now, there's nest boxes up in everybody's yard, but the chickadees would come and look around and say, well, there's not enough food here. We're not even going to try to reproduce. If they did try to reproduce, those nests contain 1.5 fewer eggs. Those clutches are 29% less likely to survive. The nest produced 1.2 fewer fledglings if they did survive, and it took them 1.5 days longer to mature. And if you put all that information together in a population growth model as a function of the percentage of non-native woody plant biomass in your yard, from none to 100%, this is what you get. The dotted line is replacement rate. That's the rate at which you have to make babies in order to replace the adults that die every year. If you reproduce at that rate, you have a sustainable population. It's not growing, but it's not shrinking either. If you make more babies than adults die, you have a growing population. But if you make fewer babies below this line here, you've got a shrinking, unsustainable population. Right here is where those lines overlap. So it suggests that generously speaking, you can have up to 30% of your woody plant biomass non-native. And we focus on woody plant biomass because that's where chickadees forage. You get 30% and without destroying the food web, as long as 70% of your woody plant biomass is native. So this is that area of compromise that I'm talking about. And I'm excited about it because if my message was you can't have any non-native plants, very few people would be listening. You can have anything that's not invasive as long as it doesn't dominate your landscape. You've got to have 70% of the productive plants. Remember, it's not the presence of non-native plants that destroys food webs. It's the absence of native plants. So if we get more native plants back into our landscape, we can establish those productive food webs. Can native plants be used in formal designs? Absolutely. I got this spring from Lynn O'Shaughnessy. This is a design that she created, taken by a drone about 400 feet up. So this is a big garden. Can't get more formal than that. But every single plant in that landscape is a native plant. Formality is a function of the design. It's not a function of the plants in the design. Our native plants are used in formal designs in Europe all the time. But I guess that's okay because they're non-native plants over there. Can we get a pollinator garden into a suburban yard like this without offending anybody? Of course we can. Put a little fence around it. It formalizes it. It tells people it's intentional. It's servicing a number of species of bees. It's not very big. It could be bigger, but if everybody did it, it would help a lot. Let's remember why we need pollinators. The news will tell you need it because they pollinate 1/3 of our crops. It's actually about 1/7 of our crops if you have a good diet. And if you have a typical diet, it's about 1/12 of our crops. I don't like that argument because a lot of people say, well, I don't live next to a farm, so I don't need any pollinators. We need pollinators because they pollinate 80% of all plants and 90% of all flowering plants. If we lost our pollinators, we'd lose 80 to 90% of the plants on the planet, and that is not an option. Where do we need pollinators? Everywhere we need plants, which is everywhere. Our native asters, great plants in California are wonderful for pollinators. So it's very easy to add pollinator-friendly plants in attractive ways. Or this design, this is a Drew Latham design. It's much bigger than the others. Imagine the amount of life that is supported here versus the amount of life that is supported here. Seems like a no-brainer. Can municipalities help us live with nature? Of course they can, and many of them are doing it. Minnesota has a cost-sharing program that encourages homeowners to reduce some or all of their lawn by putting in appropriate Minnesota prairie plants. It's called the Lawn to Legume program. Very, very popular. A lot of people taking advantage of that. Florida has a program that municipalities are encouraging people. I guess it's an island off of Florida that has burrowing owls. It's a listed species. They said, we will pay you to allow burrowing owls to burrow in your front yard. And a lot of people take them up on it. This is the way the Endangered Species Act should have been written, with carrots rather than sticks. If you have an endangered species on your property, we're going to pay you to take care of it rather than fine you if you do something with your property. Everybody would want an endangered species. St. Louis, Missouri, and Fayetteville, Arkansas have a bounty on Callery pears. This is one of our most invasive ornamental trees in the East. You take out a Callery pear and they give you a free tree replacement. And even utilities, public utilities are getting into the act. At San Antonio, you get a $100 coupon to put in water efficient native plants rather than the thirsty non-natives. And of course, the big lawn conversion programs in California that encourage you to shrink your lawns or get rid of it with appropriate xeric plantings. You don't have the water for grass, for European cool season grasses, up to $2 per square foot rebate to get rid of that lawn. I think we've made 3 missteps in the early years of conservation. And the first one's a serious one. We've assumed that nature's important. We like it, but not essential, which means when push comes to shove, when resources are in short supply, which is always, nature takes a back seat. I went to the Cincinnati Zoo before the virus broke out, and they had this wall-sized poster there, which to me epitomizes our society's view of conservation. We want to save nature, we want to save wildlife so that future generations can enjoy it. That was Teddy Roosevelt's argument for creating the national park system. Got to save these wonderful places so that future generations can enjoy it. And I get that, but it suggests nature's there just for entertainment. No wonder we don't think it's essential. It's much more than that. We need to save nature so that we have future generations. A little bit more urgent. We've also assumed that humans and nature cannot coexist. And we talked about this, but if we continue doing that, we're going to fail. That restricts conservation efforts just to areas with very few humans, which means they'd be too small, too isolated from each other, and too few in order to conserve the amount of nature that we need to conserve. David Quammen has an excellent analogy between a Persian rug and an ecosystem. That's a functional Persian rug. That is not 71 Persian rugs. That's 71 rug fragments, none of which are acting like a Persian rug. And that's what we've done to our ecosystems. The UN designates biosphere reserves as places of ecological significance. I hate that language because it suggests there are places on planet Earth with no ecological significance. Not so. Every square inch of the planet has ecological significance, including our yards, including our corporate landscapes, including our roadsides, even including much of our agriculture. So we need to glue our rug back together again. We need to put the plants back, not just to connect viable habitat with each other, but to create viable habitat where we've already destroyed it. For the first time in modern history, humans and nature are going to learn to live together because it's our only choice. Our third misstep was to leave Earth stewardship to just a few specialists. We didn't see it as a responsibility for everybody, just a few ecologists, few conservation biologists. But I don't know why we didn't see it as a responsibility for everybody, because every person on the planet depends entirely on the quality of Earth's ecosystem. So why wouldn't everybody bear the responsibility of good Earth stewardship? Stan Rushworth, a Cherokee elder, once said, the Western settler mindset was, I have rights. The mindset of indigenous people is, I have obligations. You're not born with those mindsets, you're taught them. We've been great at teaching this one. We have been terrible at teaching our kids and our peers what our obligations to good Earth stewardship are. It doesn't mean you have to save biodiversity for a living, but you can save it where you live. And if you do, it empowers you. Right now, so many people feel powerless. The Earth's problems are huge. What can one person do to turn things around? Well, one person can shrink their lawn. One person can use keystone plants. One person can get rid of their invasive plants that we didn't even talk about. One person can put in a pollinator garden. One person can turn out their lights. One person can totally revitalize the ecosystem in their yard, which will enhance their local ecosystem instead of degrade it. And it also shrinks the problem down to something that's manageable for each one of us. Don't think about the entire planet's problem. You get depressed if you do that. Just think about the little piece of the earth that you can influence. If you own property, it's obvious. That's where you start. If you don't own property, help somebody who does. Help a park or preserve. Help a land conservancy. They're all underfunded. They're all understaffed. They will love you as a volunteer. So as property owners or volunteers, each one of us has the power. We certainly have the responsibility to fix dead landscapes like this. Whether or not we do so is going to determine nature's fate and then ultimately our own fate. I think I've convinced my grandchildren that you are nature's best hope. I hope I've convinced you as well. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tallamy, for sharing your message of hope with us today and ways that we can all be a part of protecting biodiversity. If you have questions, we're going to go into a Q&A session right now. So please put your questions into the Q&A box. We already have a few to start off with, but please put them there. And I do want to say that you are getting a lot of appreciation in our chat box, and sparked a really great conversation of people throughout California on where they can find native plants within their communities and ways that they can be involved in volunteer efforts. So inspiring us to action. Thank you so much. And we are going to sort of move on to the Q&A. So again, put your questions in the Q&A and we will start going through those. So the first question that we have for you today is somebody wants to know if you know of any similar bird studies that have been done in California on the insects that the birds eat here in California.
No. This is new stuff. So that study, we're still publishing papers from that study. It's the first one to be done anywhere. So we don't want to over interpret it. That was a study with one bird species in one location, and we came up with that 70% figure. And people all over the country are saying, okay, we need 70%. That's a suggestion. We need to do it more often. This was an NSF funded study, but the problem with NSF is they fund novel ideas. It's not novel anymore. They're not going to fund that again. So it's hard to repeat it in other places. It needs to be done. Whoever does it's going to get something similar, but no, it hasn't been done in California that I know of. People work on projects and it takes them years to actually get it published. So I don't know of any right now.
Sounds great. Something we'll have to keep our eye on. So our next question is, of our native oaks in the California Central Valley, is the valley oak the most beneficial for caterpillars?
Is it the most beneficial? Is that the question?
Yes.
Well, there are 91 species of oaks in the country, and we have not lined them all up and compared them. I just had a student that compared 16 species in the East, and there are some differences. The white oak group is a little bit better than the red oak group, but not much. All of the oaks are good, very good, as a matter of fact. Many of them hybridize with each other, which means their leaf chemistry is so similar that the caterpillars don't recognize differences between them. So I can't tell you whether the valley oak is better than Gamble's oak or any of your other Western oaks, the blue oaks. My prediction is they're all really good. So I would plant the oaks that are most adapted to exactly where you are, your soil type, which side of the mountain you're on. And also be mindful of the types of diseases that are clobbering our oaks these days. So in the East here, we've got bacterial leaf scorch, which is very hard in the red oak group. A little further west, there's oak wilt, which is harder on the white oak group. So I'm losing my red oaks, but I'm planting more white oaks. And you've got sudden oak death syndrome. So try to, oh dear. Sorry, that's my daughter. Maybe she's going to tell me about Zoe's found another lizard. I don't know. So if you can ask your local extension agents which oaks are going to be most resistant to the diseases we have, that's what I would do, and then you're likely to do better.
Great, that's very helpful. So our next question is: can you address the question of using plant cultivars versus straight species, and if there are any new insights you have on this?
We did a study with that. One of actually 3 studies now that I know of. The answer is it depends on what the cultivar trait is that you're looking at. The study we did looked at traits on woody plants, not on flowers. So the habit, if you took a tall plant and made it small, if you increased the berry size, if you changed leaf color from green to red or purple or variegated, if you introduced disease resistance, those were the traits that we looked at. And the only trait that consistently reduced insect use was taking a green leaf and making it red or purple. And for some reason, we love those red leaf cultivars. I actually think they're ugly, but they sell really well. But that's one thing I can tell you, the insects don't like, because they've loaded the leaves with anthocyanins, which are feeding deterrents. So try to stick to the green leaf ones. The one thing I don't know or I don't like about cultivars is that almost all of them are propagated clonally, which means you're putting zero genetic variability out there in nature. Genetic variability is the stuff of evolution. That's what natural selection works on. And right now we are challenging our plant community tremendously with climate change and all of the extreme environmental situations we have. They need as much genetic variability as possible to adapt to these challenges. So for that reason alone, I would favor straight species every chance you get. And I know when you go to the nursery, most of what they carry are cultivars. Actually, I didn't tell you about the latest study that came out. It's one out of Penn State where they have just put in a very, it's a big experimental garden. And they did a really well-designed study on pollinators using plants of straight species versus cultivars. But they very carefully, they built the garden around productive plants. And the plants they have used, the cultivars they have used, supported pollinators really well. So you can find cultivars that make a lot of nectar and good pollen. There's a lot of cultivars that don't. So again, it varies, and you just have to figure it out by looking at what's useful or what's not. Unfortunately, there are thousands of cultivars, and nobody's studied all of them. So if you go to the nursery and all they offer is cultivars, say, "I'd like a straight species." They say, "We don't carry that." Say, "Can you get it for me?" and either they get it for you or you say, "Okay, goodbye." There are people that sell them. And if the nurseries hear that enough, they'll know there's a market there. They don't want to carry plants and nobody's going to buy. So you have to demonstrate to them that there's a market.
Great. Well, that segues really well into the next question, actually, is how can we encourage local nurseries to focus more on native plants? And how can we also think about sort of our city planners and how we can get them to maybe focus on planting more native trees, since a lot of our trees are introduced here?
Yeah, I measured the tree diversity in Portland, Oregon, which isn't that far from you. 92% non-native. So that's what happens in the West. I know. Yeah, we're just as bad in the East. So how do you get nurseries to carry more native plants? Do what I said. Go there and say, "I want to buy this." And if they don't have it, leave. When they realize that they're missing out on a market, and more of them are. The native plant nursery business across the country is booming. They can't keep up with the demand. So that message gets across. These people just want to sell plants. They're not trying to prop up Chinese plants. They just want to sell plants, but they've got to be convinced you're going to buy them. How do you get your city planners to know that this is what you want? Well, any elected official, you elected them. So make it known that this is an important issue. In the past, it's been so much on the back burner. Nobody mentions it. So they do what they've always done. I can almost guarantee that all of your city planners are not ecologists and they have no background in this. And unfortunately, a lot of the land managers have no background in ecology either. So they need to be educated that these are important issues. This is important to the voting public. And it's up to you as the citizenry to get this message across. It is getting across in a lot of municipalities. So it's not hopeless.
Great. Another way we can be involved in moving this effort forward.
Right. Very important.
Awesome. So our next question is, so here in California, there's a big push to sort of clean up our landscapes and yards to reduce the risk of fire, because we have a lot of wildfires out here. So we were wondering if you had advice on how to strike the balance to still support insects while also, trying to do our part in reducing the risk of wildfire.
Well, this is one way that your evergreen oaks are actually good at fire retardants, because many, your serious destructive fires are not small ground fires. They're the wind-blown embers that go for a mile. Well, if you have big live oaks surrounding your house, they intercept those embers. Most of the fuel in your Western fireflies are the houses themselves. Your houses are built out of very flammable stuff. So the object is to keep them from igniting, and the big oaks are excellent ways to intercept those flying embers. But you live in fire climax communities that frequently burned, and they frequently burned with low impact ground fires. So, the cleaning up is keeping the debris on the ground low, not completely absent. That's where all those guys have to pupate and everything, but it doesn't take that much. And by the way, and you might all turn your machines off when I say this, but eucalyptus is not the way to go, folks. That is a fire explosive tree. It sheds a ton of bark and everything on the ground. It is all highly flammable, and it doesn't support very much biodiversity. So from fire perspective alone, it's a good reason to stop with the eucalyptus stuff.
There's a lot of people that would definitely agree with you on that. It's a difficult, we have a lot of them out here, unfortunately. So our next question is, how do we fix biodiversity loss in our agricultural landscapes? Because California has a big agricultural component.
Yeah, that's a problem in California, but it's a problem everywhere where we have agriculture. There are a couple of obvious things that can be done. On the edges of ag fields, we invented Roundup Ready corn and soybeans. I don't think that's true of almonds, but that allowed growers to spray right up to the roadside and kill all of the weeds. Now, these are outside of their production fields, so it was strictly aesthetic. They killed the weeds, which means the milkweed, the asters, all the things that support the 4,000 species of native bees and much of the biodiversity there, and then they plant grass. So lining, particularly in the Midwest, tens of thousands of square miles of corns and soybeans that used to have pretty good biodiversity on roadsides is now totally sterile because it's been replaced with grass. We can put those weed patches, those native plant patches back along roadsides. We can restore hedgerows as much as possible. I know we have giant machines, but there are ways to get those hedgerows in there and make them native plants instead of invasive plants. Pollinator strips. There's experimenting with this in Iowa, and it's been very successful, where they put in, maybe 5-10 yards wide of a pollinator strip across the field, counter to the direction of water flow. So when it rains, it intercepts, those strips intercept topsoil. They intercept the excess fertilizer and pesticides that have been applied to the field, keep it out of the watershed so you don't have a dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. And they support a ton of pollinators and natural enemies. It does take a little bit of land out of production. I think that shouldn't go on the growers' backs. I think we as a society should pay to compensate for any land loss that is going to biodiversity protection, because it's an ecosystem service we all need and we all enjoy. It shouldn't just be that the farmers have to pay for it. And that goes for agriculture in California as well. I mean, about your bee situation in the almond groves. You've gotten rid of every plant except an almond tree, which blooms for 2 weeks of the year. What are the pollinators supposed to do the rest of the year? Get some plants back in there with a sequence of bloom that will support native pollinators, and you won't have such a honeybee crisis where you don't have enough bees to pollinate the almonds. And if you have to sacrifice a few square feet to do that, it's worth it. It's worth it. It's an ecological no-brainer, and you've got the good soil to do it too.
Absolutely. That's very good insight, and definitely issues that the California Department of Fish and Wildlife is actively working through, to think more about pollinators and how we can do things in our state. So our next question says, you describe a habitat-based approach to conservation. Many folks want to captive rear insects to conserve them. Can you discuss the pros and cons of either approach?
Well, we're not going to save the monarch or anything else with captive rearing. It's a very powerful educational tool. We can captivate the interest of young and old alike and get them to be productive members of the conservation community. So from that perspective, I like it. But if we think, what's the percentage of monarchs you have left now? 0.02% or something? You're practically on the edge of monarch extinction in the West. So there's so few now. And I know the temptation in the East, 90% of the monarch eggs are killed by ants before they even hatch. But that's normal. So you say, well, look at all the death. Yeah, it is death. And if you save them all, yes, you'd have more monarchs. But there are arguments against it. A lot of people don't know how to rear them. You could introduce diseases into the natural population. So there's this plus and minus. I would say, I will say I don't know which is better, but the only way we're going to actually do effective conservation is by putting the habitat back. And remember what habitat is. It's not just a place to live, it's food to eat. And the food to eat is even more important because there are places to live out there. So by habitat for insects, you're talking about the host plants. Put the host plants back and they have a good chance of saving themselves, despite or encouraged by captive rearing.
Thank you for sharing your thoughts on that. I think all of us are grappling with, these similar things with very low numbers out here in California for sure. We have someone who wants to know if you can elaborate on the importance of not using hybrids and instead using true natives when we're thinking about planting.
Okay, a lot of people use the word cultivar and hybrid interchangeably. A true hybrid is a cross between two species, and it's often between a native species and a non-native species. That has diluted the native gene pool considerably, and I can guarantee those plants are not as productive as the straight species. A cultivar of a straight species, and some people call them nativars, are just a genetic variant of that species where it captures some, but not all the genetic variation in that species. Enhancing a particular trait that we find attractive. So, there's a phlox in Georgia that was a natural variant growing in the wild. Called Phlox paniculated Jenna. And somebody found it, maybe Jenna found it, I don't know, and named it. But it turns out it's got twice the number of flowers on it as the regular phlox population. It was a natural variant found out there. So twice the number of flowers, twice the butterflies. And they said, here's cultivars are great. In that case, they are. But I can also give you a case where there's any double flower that's a cultivar has taken the reproductive parts of the flower and turned them into petals. So it's pretty, but there's zero nectar and zero pollen. So that, is contributing nothing. It's simply a decoration. So that's why I say it depends on which cultivar you're talking about. Hybrids, though, I would always stay away from them.
That's helpful. Our next question is, are you aware of any states that have mandated that all sort of state properties be planted with native plants? And if not, and if California was the first, would you support us in that effort? And do you have insight on how we should start?
I don't know of any states that have done that. I know of cities that have done it. Reston, Virginia did it years ago. Right after I wrote Bringing Nature Home, somebody bought every member of the town council a copy of the book. And they right there, they passed a law that says every public planting in Reston, Virginia is going to be natives. Great. And they did it because they could. Doing it statewide, in today's climate, and I mean political climate, anything that comes down from the top where you say you have to do this or you're not allowed to do that is going to be challenged in a serious way, simply because we're saying you have to do it or you can't do it. I mean, look at the hubbub over vaccines. There's all kinds of arguments to say it makes sense to get a vaccine, but people still say, you can't tell me what to do. If we say you can't plan anything else, I guarantee there'll be big pushback. So, I guess I'd work at the city level first. That's going to be a lot easier. And you're talking about public properties. And you'd probably have more luck if you said maybe 80% native or something like that. We're talking about culture change. And culture change is really hard, but it is easier to change culture from within the tribe rather than from outside the tribe. So become a member of the town council or it makes ecological sense, but that doesn't mean it's going to be bought right away. Although I will say, I've been talking about this for 15 years, and I do see a lot of improvement. A lot of places are doing this on their own. So it is possible.
Awesome. That's great to hear. And I will mention we had several sort of people asking questions about how can we get our HOAs involved or our local cities.
Join the HOA. Join, infiltrate. That's how you do it. And you know what? I am getting emails from people who have done that. And they're not getting the pushback they thought they would. They've joined it. They've explained. They said, this is the way we are. Again, people saying, okay. So the change might come faster than we think.
That's very inspiring and great to hear. We have a question of wondering are there smaller woody species that have high visitation for insects for folks that might not have room to plant trees? Are there any sort of advice you have there?
That's a good question. So I'll start with number one. That's the oaks. You actually have in the West, we don't have them in the East, but in the West, you've got oaks that are actually ground covers. They grow very low to the ground. There's a number of dwarf species. And I actually have a list of them somewhere. Actually, if you get my latest book, The Nature of Oaks, it's in there to tell you which species are tiny. In the East here, we've got dwarf chinkapin oak, dwarf chestnut oak, dwarf live oak. I've got dwarf chestnut oak on my property. They made acorns when they were 5 feet tall. So they're ideal for small properties. Bare oak, there are options out there. Sometimes it can be a challenge to find them in the industry. So this is where the industry needs to be encouraged. Get some acorns, get these things going, because there is that misperception that every species of oak is gigantic and I can't use it in small properties. And that's just not true.
Great. That's really helpful. We'll definitely encourage people to check out your latest book and get more insight there. Yeah, right. So I do want to recognize that we are getting close to noon. So we know that some people have to drop off. Dr. Tallamy has been very nice in offering to stay and answer a couple more questions for us. I didn't know, Whitney, did you want to jump in with any sort of tech logistics?
No, I was just going to say the exact same thing, recognizing that we're almost to noon, but we're going to stay on for a few extra minutes and see if we can get through a few more of these questions. If you do have to jump off, we are again posting the recording of the lecture to our website, so you can always go back and check to see any of the questions that you may have missed. But yeah, let's take a few more.
Great. So the next question I have is, where can we find native grasses for where we live? I like having grasses in the backyard for my dogs to play in, and I want to plant native grasses rather than invasive or at least drought tolerant grasses. So do you have any good resources on how we can think about sort of grasses that are easy to live with, but also good for the environment?
California Native Plant Society. They know what belongs where you live, wherever it is, and the sources of those species. So again, you Californians are lucky. You've got the best native plant society in the country by far. They're paid positions. These are real people doing real jobs that can help you do this type of, answer these types of questions. So take advantage of it.
Absolutely. And I will say California Native Plant Society, a lot of resources went into the chat. So do look there as well, because it sounds like they're on top of it and have a lot of great resources.
They are on top of it, yes.
Great. So another question is, we would like to hear your recommendations for citizen science efforts that best support biodiversity projects like what you presented today.
Well, that's a good question. I mean, there is no central repository of where can I go to look for a citizen science project? Usually they come out of academia. Somebody has a project where citizen science could contribute, citizen scientists could contribute a lot. So they'll advertise, like the Cornell, Lab for Ornithology has a number of these big projects, and they will advertise when they have a project that people could jump in on. That's how eBird got started, a very powerful tool that really just started in the bird community. But But yeah, how do you find out about them? I'm not sure. Listservs for your favorite group. People will often advertise on that and say, I've got this project, I'm looking for this or that. And keep your ear, to the wherever you keep your ears, and you'll hear about these things. But it's a good question. I don't think there's a central place you can go to find out who's looking for people. Unfortunately, there should be.
It looks like people are also, again, offering resources in the chat who know about this as well.
Good. They know more about it than that.
Hoping to, at least in this setting, bring that together. And this is kind of a similar question to citizen science. Do you have any advice about approaching schools to build natural areas and campuses and ways to sort of make this accessible and teachable to schools?
All I can say is schools are much more open to it now than they used to be. A lot of schools own fairly sizable properties. They're getting past the idea that, I used to have schools say, we want to put native plants in, but nothing that blooms and will attract bees. Because of course, if you have bees, somebody's going to get stung, which is not at all a certainty, but that was what they're thinking. And they don't want to get sued and then blah, blah, blah. But they're much more open to it at this point. They recognize that getting some native plantings into school systems is a wonderful learning opportunity. How do you do that? You go to I would go to the science teachers in the particular school and say, do you know about this movement? If you don't, here are some books, and let's get this school involved. And they're usually excited about it. They're probably more knowledgeable about it now than you think. Sometimes resources are the issue, but there's some local grants that, or just somebody writes a check. It doesn't cost a lot of money to do these things, but they are efforts that keep giving to the kids year after year after year in an educational way. So it's definitely worth doing.
Great. And we have a couple more questions for you if you have the time. So one person asked, do you believe more empirical data about the use by species of easements areas could help encourage sort of rebuilding goals for biodiversity?
Yes. And even though many of the questions we ask, we already know the general answer, having the empirical data that can show you not just that there's more, but there's this much more. And this is the diversity associated with it. And these are the critical species it's helping. Those kinds of numbers always do seem to help. They turn heads. So there are people working on roadside, particularly pollinator habitats. Several years ago, Obama came out with this pollinator initiative, say we're gonna help pollinators all over roadsides, and he did it before we had the data or the plants. And it kind of, it floundered because nobody could even get the plants to support this initiative. And there also wasn't a lot of money behind it, but you got people thinking about it, and people continue to think about it. So there are some big initiatives, particularly for the monarch. But if you help the monarch, you're helping a lot of other things. Called these, the Monarch Corridor. They're trying to build connective corridors along roadsides from Canada all the way down to Mexico. You guys, it is time to work with your monarchs, folks. So you got to get the milkweeds back pretty much everywhere. That's what they need. And I've heard the argument, they need eucalyptus so they can overwinter. They need to hang on something. That's true. And they do use eucalyptus because it's all that's there. But do they need it? What they need is the milkweed to make the monarchs so that you have millions of them so they can get it through the challenge times. Fires, terrible, but get the plants back after the fires. And roadsides are a wonderful way to do that. So.
Great. And then our last question for you is regarding the lanternfly or invasive species more generally. How little do we understand their impact and how limited is our ability to manage them?
Talking about the spotted lanternfly, I have it in my yard right now. You guys don't have it yet, right? You don't want it. I don't think it's made it out west. Came in Pennsylvania. Several of the invasive species have come into Pennsylvania. So what do we need to know about their negative impacts? I would say we don't need to spend a lot of money studying their negative impacts. They're going to be bad. And ask the apple industry or the grape industry, they'll be bad without investing in seeing how bad. We need to figure out what to do about it. The big thing is how do we stop bringing these guys in? We brought the spotted lanternfly in because we brought in ornamental rocks from China. And we did that obviously because there's no ornamental rocks in all of North America. So we brought in these white rocks from China that had egg masses on them. And it wasn't that long ago. I mean, these are silly things. If we took the bill of cleaning up the spotted lanternfly from now in the next 100 years and charged the company that brought in those rocks, we wouldn't do things like that anymore. Instead, you get to pollute the world and there's no consequence to it. What do we do about it? That is the problem. Once they're here, it is a huge problem. There are no silver bullets. Biocontrol, if people are right away looking for natural enemies of these things, sometimes it works wonderfully, but it often takes a long time, 10 years minimum to get the permission just to release anything. So hard to count on it, but I even forget what the question was. I'm sure I didn't answer it though. So.
No, I think you did. It was sort of your thoughts on how to think about invasive species.
Yeah, so. They're terrible. They're terrible. Let's not bring them in. So once they're here looking for a silver bullet, very tough to do that.
Absolutely. Well, that is all our questions, and invasive species is a hard way to end. So I do want to encourage people to look at the chat because there is a lot of inspiring.
One more thing I'll say about invasive species: get rid of them on your property. That's all you can worry about, or you have to worry about. You do have to worry about them on your property. If everybody did that across the country, it'd be 78% done. So that's your responsibility, both insect and plant invasive species out of there off your property. Then you can feel good.
Great. That's how we can all be a part of management and contribute to our ecosystem. So thank you so much. I'm going to turn it over to Whitney and she's going to close us out.
Yeah, I'm just going to close this out with a couple of logistics. But before I do that, Doug, any final thoughts, comments you want to share with the group before we end it here for today? Anything we didn't address?
I'll just reiterate that you all are an important piece of the future of conservation, every one of you. So I don't know, take that to bed tonight with you.
A good reminder. Well, thank you so much to both of you, Doug, for making the time to be here. Great presentation. And thank you, Madeline, as well, for helping to coordinate and make all of this happen. Really appreciate the both of you. And we, as I mentioned earlier, we will be posting the recording within the next couple of weeks to our lecture series website. And we don't typically post the chat box conversation, but because there was such a robust exchange of ideas and links in the chat, I've tried to capture as many as I can. And I'll put together kind of a condensed list of resources and some of the comments, and we'll try to post that alongside the recording for anyone who wants to check that out as well. So thank you so much.
Could you send that to me as well? Because I couldn't see all the links and
Absolutely. Yes. And we've also captured a lot of the different comments for you, Doug, so I'll make sure that you get to see those as well. Great. So with that, thank you all so much for joining the talk today. And thank you again to Doug and Madeline. And we hope to see you next time for the next installment of the lecture series. And also please go forth and celebrate Biodiversity Day and Biodiversity Week and year and contribute in any way that you can. So thanks, everyone. Have a great day, and we'll see you next time.
Okay. Thank you.
Bye-bye.